What if the greatest threat to American democracy isn't the left and it isn't the right? What if it's something much older? Something the founders feared from the very beginning? We'll talk about this. And this is Politics by Jake.
This is Politics by Jake. Most commentators merely report events. Jake decodes and reveals the hidden systems beneath the headlines. He exposes the enduring, sometimes generational patterns that govern history, politics, economics, and human behavior. Jake names the unnamed. He brings into focus the things that were hiding, sometimes even in plain sight. And now, here's Jake.
All right, and this is Politics by Jake. Welcome to the weekend show. This is part two. It's set to air on Sunday, July 12th. I was going to say September. Holy smokes, not quite. Still got a couple of months to go yet. Set to air on July 12th. There, I said it again. July 12th, 2026. And we welcome you to the show. And as I always say, we welcome you to 2026. We welcome you to the fight. We have an existential election, just very serious. Couldn't be more serious than what it is. And this election determines whether the United States continues as a democracy or even as a democratic republic or totally is captured by oligarchy and technologarchy and corporate interests and turns into an oligarchy with, some democratic aspects to it, or whether it turns into something that's even worse, like a kingship or a dictatorship. And on the show, as Brian said, that was our announcer, Brian Barrymore. On the show, I analyze political and economic situations in the world. And the idea is that you listen to this, it helps you position yourself, it helps you protect yourself. Now, if you like this kind of analysis, I do also one-on-one strategy sessions. You can give me a call. The link is in the description and on the clips, and we can get together, and that'd be great. I'd love to do that. Now, let's talk about, of course, Donald Trump, and there's just so much to say about this guy. I was, I haven't really had the time to do what I wanted to do, which was there was some primary research I did on the fact that Trump is a racist. And he is. He's a racist. The Nixon administration, and I want to tell you more about this. I don't think I'm going to be able to do it, but I'm going to just throw out a few things here and there so you can get an idea. Because the Trump agenda is on the ballot for November 2026, whether you like it or not, and whether you want things to continue and whether you think that it's going to get worse. If Donald Trump is able to hold on to the Senate and hold on to the House, it's going to be bad. It's going to be hell on wheels. He recently fired, the Supreme Court handed him a decision, which is bad. It was also mimicked by the Tennessee Supreme Court, which basically said that the executive had complete control over hiring and firing on federal committees. And so he dismissed everyone, basically fired them on the bipartisan Federal Elections Committee. You know that Donald Trump thinks that something is up. He knows what's in the wind. He knows he's got to hold on to power and he's going to be desperate. And he doesn't care about doing these kinds of things. They don't bother him at all. This is not a democratic person. Getting back to the racism thing, well, I mean, he was sued. That This is the thing that cracks me up. Of all administrations, the Nixon administration sued him, and it was either 1972 or 1973. You know why? Wouldn't let African Americans into his projects. And at that time, his father, Fred, was alive, so they sued them. And I've speculated before that this is one of the reasons that it's been stated by Donald Trump that everything's so unfair. I've been treated so unfairly. And, Donald Trump hasn't been treated unfairly. We'll probably talk about that a little bit more on the show. This is probably the genesis of it. In 1972, in the Nixon administration, of all things, that's like the old saying, Nixon can only go to China. Only someone like Nixon could sue Donald Trump for racism, or the administration. So anyway, and there are various other aspects of this that I will bring to your attention. But I want to, because this is a person, he's a terrible person. He shouldn't be involved in government. And of all of the ad hominem attacks, and I do them. I do the ad hominem attacks, which I attack him as a person because he's worthy, he's a public figure, and I mean that's the job. You're going to get attacked like that. There are legitimate reasons why he should not be allowed to continue with the power that he should, and that the palace courtiers and that the seekers of access to power, to Donald Trump, who will bend over marvelously, amazingly, to do his will, and hold his coat while he does the raping, and look the other way while he does the raping and the pillaging and the plundering of the treasury, and while he engages in foreign policy with an eye towards acquisition and graft. This is a guy who shouldn't be in government, because everything he does is going to be for himself and the enrichment of himself and his family, especially his sons, to the tune of billions of dollars. And he doesn't care about you, you maggots. He doesn't care about you. One of the things that he said once was that if he ever ran for office, he would run as a Republican, because the Republicans, he said, are the dumbest voters alive. You can tell them anything and they'll believe it. And I'm speaking extemporaneously here. I'm not citing chapter and verse. This is the great thing about the internet. Back in the 60s and the 70s, when the internet was not even thought of, it was important to reference these statements. Otherwise, it could be that you were saying anything and it wasn't necessarily going to be able to be proven to be true. Now you can check all of this stuff out. So I urge you to do so. And a person like this shouldn't be in office. Trump is selling his office just in case to the highest bidder, because this is, his mentality. He thinks it's normal. He really thinks this is normal, and he knows that other billionaires, other oligarchs, other technologarchs, and corporate interests, they have this exact same attitude, and he doesn't see anything wrong with it. And the difference is that they work silently, so you don't see what it is they are doing. You don't hear much about Elon Musk, for example, being a trillionaire, although he apparently, the news I read is that he was a trillionaire for about a week, and then he slipped back. He's not a trillionaire anymore. But who knows? People like him will try. But Musk works more quietly. He wants to work behind the scenes. Trump loves the acclaim. He loves the attention. He's the perfect poster child for the billionaire set, the Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, who famously said, or infamously as the case may be, in Davos, Switzerland in January of 2024, we are all in for Trump. And he was talking about the billionaire class. That's what he was talking about, because they're the same. And you don't think they knew who their man was? You don't think they knew who Donald Trump was? This pathetic. He actually is pathetic. Most people are afraid of him. I suppose there's reason when you have someone like him in power to be afraid of him. But he's pathetic. He's this person who imitates and wants to be like these billionaires. He wants to be like these dictators. He wants to be like Little Kim the Rocket Man. He wants to be like Xi, the emperor or the president for, I say emperor, but president for life. That's an emperor. That's a king for life in mainland China. He wants to be like Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. This is what he wants. And this is how he conducts his policy. He's done foolishly in the Iran war, He's now got a death sentence against him, and he's not conducting it in a proper way. Um, Other historians, colleagues of mine, although I don't, I guess I categorize myself as a historian, but I'm really more a student of history, is what I am. I can sit in the room with people who are actual historians who have PhDs in it, and I understand what they're saying, and I can get something of it. But I'm not in that class, and I don't purport to be. Law and business is what I'm in. That's what I've spent my time in. But I am a student of history. I've always loved history because it's just so important to understand history. It's as important as quantum physics. Because if you don't understand history, you will not know what has happened, and everything will seem new when actually all of these things repeat. And some people say history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Well, I don't know. The situations can be pretty similar. They can actually be really pretty similar. But if you know history, you can be apprised and you can be guided by what happened. He doesn't know history at all. All he knows about is himself. As I was saying about these billionaires, they work silently, but they very much resent a free press. In fact, they hate a free press because a free press, it exposes their misdeeds, their maladroitness, and that is why they are now openly and zealously attempting to take it over and co-opt it. You see this with CBS, you see it with Paramount, you see it with ABC, and they already have long since owned Fox News. I mean, Rupert Murdoch, he's an oligarch from way back, and he bends to this kind of audience, which is the right wing, easily gullible, credulous, easily led audience, who he can say these things to. And he loves a guy like Donald Trump because Donald Trump is great for news. He is. He's great for news because he comes on and he says things. That's what people love. Back in New York, in the old days, when he was there, they used to call him the Mouth. And the reason why they called him the Mouth was because he would never shut up. But he was considered to be eccentric. He was always good for a laugh. He was always saying crazy things. And so he was sought after. But billionaires, it's nothing. I mean, it's nothing for a billionaire to take a few $100 million and throw it towards some media outlet like One American News Network, which is owned by a billionaire, or Newsmax. That's another one. They think nothing of this, but the idea is that they want their news heard. And so now they're in a position where, thanks to Donald Trump, they can begin to take over some of these networks that we all watch, like CBS, like operations like Paramount Plus and Paramount, for example, and take it over and bend it to their. And this is, this is difficult for ordinary Americans to believe. We've been raised on the idea that we're all Americans, that public office is a trust, the public trust, that the institutions of government ultimately belong to the people. But the plain, crucial, and important truth is this: there are people who already have descended to this level of thinking. They inhabit it. Donald Trump has become their poster boy. Um, like I said, as Jamie Dimon said, we're all in for Trump. Take the lesson, will you? These people are out there. They're moving methodically to capture America. I talked about it on yesterday's show. And to reshape it into something ugly, something deformed, a bastardized version of what America was intended to be. And if you cannot accept that conclusion today, I ask, at least please leave room for the possibility that this, in fact, may be true. Then do your research, do your own thinking, because, that's the duty of every American citizen. Every American who takes his citizenship seriously. Now, we're seeing ICE, Immigrations, Customs, and Enforcement, operating across the country. Yes, I have called them the modern Gestapo, and I'll tell you why, with some qualifications that I'll go into in a minute. Reports indicate they have arrested recently thousands of people. Last week, I cited a report putting that figure for the week roughly at 10,000 arrests. That's remarkable. That's a remarkable number of arrests. And I've said before on this program, there was an open microphone involving Donald Trump and Pam Bondi, in which Trump discussed going after his enemies because, in his view, there wasn't enough time. He was running out of time. Whether you agree with these conclusions or not, what follows from that is important. Donald Trump has always viewed politics personally. He divides people into friends and enemies. And when government begins operating from that premise, we should all be paying attention. We know who these people are. We know who Donald Trump considers his enemies. This is one of the killers. He considers Antifa his enemy. What's Antifa? Anti-fascists. The United States is the most anti-fascist nation in the world. It's the most anti-fascist nation the world has ever seen. And yet, these are his enemies. And there is no Antifa organization per se. But this is considered one of his enemies, and he will arrest these people using the power and the auspices of ICE. And we know this administration is increasingly framed political disagreement in personal terms rather than constitutional ones. But here's what you're not being told. These operations are making mistakes. They're making serious mistakes. They're detaining the wrong people. They just recently arrested a nun. And they arrested a nun. They're being sued. In some cases, they released her. In some cases, they've attempted to detain people who turned out to be law enforcement officers themselves because they look suspicious, including in one instance, it came to my attention, a police captain. I think they tried to arrest a judge. Those mistakes have consequences. They cost money. And who ultimately pays? We do, the taxpayers. Now, look, when they sue and a settlement is reached, who pays it? The taxpayers. You pay it. None of that means that these operations are going to stop. Quite the contrary. If anything, it demonstrates what happens when ideology begins to override judgment. That's the danger. That's the danger. I've said on this program before that there are some things which tragically never seem to disappear, and one of them is racism. I talked about Donald Trump as a racist, which he definitely is. And I promise we'll get into that more. But racism is just the evil gift that keeps on giving. Generation after generation, decade after decade, it simply refuses to die. It changes its language, it changes its appearance, but it survives. And when propaganda feeds that impulse, when fear feeds that impulse, when politics rewards that impulse, you begin to see the results. And this is what concerns me. Not simply today's headlines, but the forces underneath them, because history teaches us that when prejudice becomes institutionalized, when it acquires political protection, the costs are borne not only by its victims, but by the entire society, financially, politically, morally. And that's where we're at today.
More of Politics by Jake after this. We'll
And
be
now
right
here's
back.
a word from one of our
More of
sponsors,
Politics by
Wayne
Jake
Consulting.
after this.
Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake.
And now, back to Jake.
Now, there's a passage of scripture, because I know I have my Christian friends, Christian evangelicals, Christian Zionists. I come out and I attack you guys because I talk about how you look at what's going on in the Middle East, and that's your news. You don't listen to politics. You do listen to Politics by Jake, because sometimes you get mad at the things I say, and it's like Howard Stern. You've got to hear what I'm going to say next. That's fine. I want you here. I don't want you to watch other news shows. I want you here watching Politics by Jake, but they look at what's happening in the Middle East with an apocalyptic view. They want there to be the end of the world. They want there to be this destruction. You know, if you've read the scriptures, if you've read the book of Revelation, if you've read the book of Ezekiel to a lesser extent, the book of Daniel, you know that these end of the world scenarios that are spoken of by the biblical prophets, they come with great destruction, with great blood, with great horror, with great misery, with great loss of life and great sadness. And there's a passage of scripture that's always stayed with me. Now, those of you, who aren't religious, bear with me for just a moment. I'm not asking you, obviously to accept the theology, although I think I know you. I think it's out there. But what I'm asking you to consider is the wisdom of the phrase itself. And there's a saying in scripture, and those of you, like I said, who are not so inclined, bear with me for a moment. I use scripture because I know many people are listening, people of faith. Others simply want to hear what I say next. Like I said, the passage is this: God shall send them strong delusion that they should believe a lie. Now, I'm not attempting to interpret scripture. Well, not really. I'm simply saying that phrase seems remarkably applicable to what we're witnessing today. You have people who have spent years in politics, years. Others have become legends in their own minds. And yet they're making this extraordinary mess of the government, which leads me to say on multiple occasions that they're destroying the government and that Donald Trump is a destroyer and that is his purpose, whether he knows it or not. And why? Why is that? It's because the desire for power has overwhelmed their capacity for reason. Power has become the objective. Everything else is secondary. Now, I hear from people, and this is funny because you've heard me talk about this in a different way. And I think it's because people are listening to the show. You have people who have spent years in politics. Others have become legends in their own mind, and yet they're making an extraordinary mess of the government. Why? Because the desire for power has overwhelmed their capacity for reason. Power has become the objective. Everything else is secondary. Now, I hear from people who say there ought to be a Nuremberg tribunal for Democratic leaders. Some say Democratic leaders should be executed. Others say their followers should spend the rest of their lives in prison. And they say these things with a straight face. Where does that kind of thing actually come from? It comes from years from propaganda, years of agitation, years of encouraging people to see political opponents not as fellow Americans with different ideas, but as enemies. And I've played some of those clips on this program. You can find them on Politics by Jake. One gentleman insisted that Donald Trump is the hand of God. He even cited Reverend Sung Moon Moon in support of that proposition. Whether you agree with that, that is the point. That's besides the point. The point is that these beliefs exist. They influence people. And some of those people now occupy positions of tremendous influence in our government. That's why this matters, because government conducted service in the service of ideology instead of reason inevitably produces disorder, and that disorder inevitably reaches every American. Donald Trump has repeatedly said he's been treated unfairly. Listen to him. Everything is unfair. That's what he says. Everything is a grievance. Everything is someone else's fault. I think that mentality has deep roots. His father, Fred Trump, was sued by the federal government over discriminating housing practices. Donald Trump has never seemed to accept the legitimacy of that intervention. Instead, he's carried that sense of grievance with him throughout his public life. Everything comes back to the same refrain. I've been treated unfairly. And I've often said that Donald Trump seems to live either in his own injured ego or he inherited from his father. Whether that's psychologically accurate, that's for others to decide. But the pattern is unmistakable. He behaves like a man who believes he is settling old scores, not just political scores, personal scores. And when someone with a mentality like that occupies the office of the President of the United States, the government itself begins to reflect those grievances. And that's dangerous. Donald Trump inherited an enormous fortune from his father. He had opportunities that very few Americans ever receive. Yet business after business failed. Trump steaks, Trump vodka, Trump University, one venture after another. And the point isn't simply that businesses fail. Businesses fail all the time. The point is that a failure never seems to produce self-examination. Instead, with Trump, instead, responsibility is also assigned, although always assigned somewhere else. Someone else is blamed. Someone else is accused of unfairness. And that same pattern now seems to appear in government itself. And that's why I believe this is more than politics. It's about character. It's about judgment. And ultimately, it's about fitness for office. And for that reason, I've said there needs to be a reckoning. I've used the phrase Nuremberg Tribunal by way of analogy. I've also said there ought to be some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission or some other, you know, lawful tribunal that examines what has occurred. But notice what I did not say. I never said Donald Trump should be executed. I never said Pete Hegseth should be executed. I never said political leaders should be imprisoned for life simply because I disagree with them. That is not my position. It never has been. What I have said is that there must be accountability. There must be an accounting. There must be a public examination of how we arrived at this point. That's what constitutional government requires. That's what the rule of law requires. And the irony is that many of the loudest voices supporting Donald Trump have no hesitation in demanding things like execution, demanding life imprisonment, demanding war crimes tribunals for their political opponents. And I ask a simple question. What war crimes are you talking about? Show me the evidence. Show me the legal basis. Show me the facts. That's how a constitutional republic is supposed to work. Not by slogans, not by vengeance, not by political hysteria, but by evidence, by law, by due process. And if there is to be a reckoning, let it occur within the constitutional framework we've inherited. Let it be public, let it be lawful, and let it be fair. But let there also be consequences where the evidence warrants them. Otherwise, we we simply invite this to happen again, and that is Politics by Jake. All right, and this is Politics by Jake, and we are back. So, as we celebrate the United States, remember this: the American experiment didn't simply begin in 1776. The struggle to build a constitutional order reaches back much further, and the founders understood something fundamental about human nature. Every society contains three competing forces: the one, the few, and the many. And a simple form of government elevates only one of those forces. Our Constitution attempts something far more difficult. It gives each of them a place within the structure of the government and channels their conflicts into peaceful political debate rather than violence. The presidency embodies the principle of the one. The Senate represents the expression of the few, oligarchy, if you will, the rich, if you will, the privileged, if you will. The Supreme Court represents another. The House of Representatives gives voice to the many. The idea is not to eliminate conflict. Um, the idea is to contain it, to organize it, to force competing interests to resolve their differences within the constitutional system rather than outside it. That is the genius of the American Republic. But here's the problem: that balance no longer functions as it was intended. Under the pressures of globalization and concentrated wealth, oligarchical principle has expanded far beyond its proper role. When districts become so large that ordinary citizens struggle to know their own representative, when wealth dominates campaigns, when influence becomes concentrated, fewer and fewer hands, the House itself begins to resemble another oligarchy. And if that happens, you have oligarchy in the courts, you have oligarchy in the Senate, you have oligarchy in the House. That's too much oligarchy. And that, I believe, is one of the central political problems confronting the United States today. Uh, we'll continue through the week examining what that means and what can be done about it.
We'll return to Jake in just a moment. We'll be right back.
And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. Now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake.
Let's return to Jake.
All right. Thank you, Brian Barrymore. All right. Now, United States Central Command says the Strait of Hormuz remains open to commercial transit. Safe passageways have been established. This is kind of interesting. You would expect that the United States military would try to find a way out of this 14-point thing where Iran would control the straits. Um, alternate pathways have been established for commercial shipping. The only exception, according to the United States policy, involves vessels violating the blockade against Iran. Hundreds of ships have reportedly transited the strait during the past 2 months. Donald Trump has claimed that approximately 200 ships carrying roughly 100 million gallons of oil successfully passed through the area despite so-called Iranian blockade. The larger issue, however, is confidence. Confidence in the shipping lane, confidence in maritime insurance, and confidence that commerce can continue without interruption. One proposal would be for the United States government to provide maritime insurance. The insurance, Lloyd's of London, and maritime insurers are antsy about that. Have the United States provide maritime insurance or guarantees for vessels using the strait. If the shipping industry knew those voyages were protected, much of the uncertainty surrounding the region could be reduced. Military escorts, air cover, destroyers, frigates, corvettes. Now, all of these are options that have been discussed whenever freedom of navigation, which is a key aspect of international law, whenever that's challenged. The bottom line is this: Iran does not control the Strait of Hormuz. Iran cannot be allowed to control the Strait of Hormuz. The greater obstacle may not be military capability, though. It may be the willingness of the insurers and the financial markets to assume the risk. And that brings us full circle. Political power, economic power, financial power, they're all connected. Understand those relationships. Understanding that it's essential if we're going to understand the world we're living in today. Uh, okay. In the time we've got left, I don't know if I can even get through this or not, but we're going to try. Let me say, I am absolutely, positively for the United States of America. I stand for the Republic, but I want to comment on something. You hear this all the time. You hear it on both sides. Um, there are those who say, Benjamin Franklin said, you have a republic if you can keep it. Now, that's not exactly what he said word for word. I don't want to allow as how that's that way, but it's pretty close. That's pretty close to what he said. The problem is what people do with it. Some people who quote that line become positively anti-democratic, or they're simply ignorant. They never get much beyond History 101, just the survey course. Maybe they've been indoctrinated into sovereign citizen ideology or certain patriot ideologies, and they've persuaded themselves that, because everybody talks about democracy, that somehow, this is constitutional heresy. Because Franklin said, we have a republic, and they become absolutely balls to the wall against the very idea of democracy. That's wrong. But so too are the people who insist this is a democracy. Well, to which I would say, well, yeah, and also no, because democracy doesn't mean today what it meant in ancient Greece. There was much closer to direct majoritarian rule, what many people would simply call mob rule. And here's where I stand. I stand for the republic, which is, as I've said many times, it's a hybrid. It is both a democracy and a republic. That is part of its genius. That, as the saying goes in the movie, that is the beauty of it. That is part of its beauty. So, have we got that now? My patriot friends, my sovereign citizen friends, I definitely have, and my Christian sect friends who embrace this kind of thinking. Do you understand what I'm saying? It is a democratic republic. Although I will admit, these days, it sometimes looks more like a democratic oligarchy. But oligarchic elements have always existed. They always have. They always will. There's no getting around that fact. I mean, that's just the case. But that isn't the proposition. The proposition isn't that Western civilization is perfect. No, and this is important. Pay attention to me for this. It's almost exactly the opposite. Western civilization is deeply, deeply imperfect. But compared to the available alternatives, it has produced an unparalleled framework for liberty, for self correction, for constitutional government, and human flourishing. And that reminds me very much of the observation attributed to Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. I think that's exactly how civilization should be judged, comparatively, not utopianly. Judge them by what they actually produce, not by what they promise, not by what they aspire to, not by what they claim. Judge them by what they actually produce. Now, let me put a name on something you've probably been seeing for years. Um, you hear it on MSNBC, you hear it on college campuses, you hear it from commentators, you hear it from politicians, you hear it in newspapers and magazines. You hear it repeated so often that after a while you begin to think these are simply isolated opinions held by isolated people. They're not. They're manifestations of an intellectual movement. The movement has a name. It's called postmodernism. Now, before your eyes glaze over and you think, oh my God, politics by Jake has suddenly become philosophy by Jake, bear with me, all right? Bear with me, because I think this explains an extraordinary amount about our politics today. Have you ever noticed that certain conclusions seem to come up over and over again? Western civilization is uniquely oppressive. Really? Western civilization is uniquely guilty. The enemies of Western civilization are somehow presumed to possess superior moral standing. You have Rousseau's Noble Savage, where the less society, the better. Traditional institutions are presumed guilty until proven innocent. The United States is assumed to be the principal source of disorder in the world. Israel is presumed to be the aggressor, regardless of the circumstance. The West is continually judged by its failures, while many of its adversaries are judged by their aspirations. These don't simply happen to be similar opinions. They arise from a common intellectual framework. And I think it is this mentality, so often expressed by the ultra left, that displays such contempt for Western civilization, while entertaining the absolute fictitious delusion that the enemies of Western civilization somehow represent the forces pushing humanity forward. I say exactly the opposite. I believe many of those movements are not progressive at all. They are profoundly in the retrograde. That is, they're moving civilizations backward, not forward. And that is where I fundamentally part company with the postmodernists. I think it is this mentality, so often expressed by the ultra left, that displays such contempt for Western civilization while entertaining the absolute fictitious delusion that the enemies of Western civilization somehow represent these forces that are pushing humanity forward. And I think this mentality ultimately traces back to an old romantic notion that long predates postmodernism itself, and it is the Rousseau-esque idea. And I just mentioned this a moment ago. The idea of the noble savage, the belief that the civilization itself is corrupting, civilization itself is corrupting, and that those who stand outside Western civilization therefore possess some inherent moral superiority, the rejection of civilization itself in favor of a romanticized alternative. I don't buy this. Not for 1 minute. Civilizations are not judged. They're not judged by mythologies. They are judged by what they actually produce. Most of the people expressing these views in the media probably couldn't tell you what postmodernism is. They have never read the philosophers. They have never studied the movement. They have simply absorbed its assumptions. They are looking at the world through a lens without realizing they are looking through a lens at all. Now, I think there are two different kinds of people advancing these ideas. There are those who have absorbed them, like I say, almost unconsciously. And then there are those who know exactly what they're doing. And the latter are the propagandists, the predators, the jackals, the willing tools of degraded regimes who promote the enormous lie that systems built upon repression, censorship, political imprisonment, religious coercion, and the suppression of dissent are somehow morally superior to the constitutional traditions of the United States of America and the nations that have adopted similar philosophies, you know, similar philosophies of government. That distinction matters because not everyone repeating these ideas understands where they came from. Now, here's where I part company with them. Western civilization deserves criticism. It deserves criticism. Every civilization deserves criticism. No civilization has clean hands. None. But I just reject the idea that criticism requires us to romanticize the alternatives. I'm reminded of the philosophy that underlay one of my favorite television series growing up, The Defenders. Its message was never that our legal system was perfect. Its message was that our legal system had to be judged against the available alternatives, which, it argued, were so much worse.
More of Politics by Jake after this.
And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake.
And now, Politics by Jake continues.
All right, this is Politics by Jake, and we're back, and we're talking about postmodernism And we talked about the defenders. We talked about the fact that all civilizations have to be judged, and that it's very much like Churchill's observations: judge systems comparatively, not against utopia. Okay. Um, Socrates, Plato reported, said, perfection is like a wheelbarrow. The wheel is perfection. You're pushing it. You never get to the wheel, but you do advance civilization. So it's not utopia against it can't be utopia against reality, because utopia is going to win every time, and it's just it's like naive. That's what I think is the question. Postmodernism too often refuses to ask this question: compared to what? Compared with what actual civilization? Compared with what actual political system? Compared with what actual historical experience? Take the Middle East just as an example. One of the things that constantly amazes me is watching the commentators who turn their backs on some of the most pro-American peoples in the Middle East, while romanticizing movements and leadership that have repeatedly rejected opportunities for peace. I think one of the best historical observations, or illustrations, I should say, is what President Bill Clinton himself later described regarding the negotiations with Yasser Arafat, who was, he called himself a Palestinian, but he was Hamas all the way. And Hamas is a proxy of Iran. It's how Iran projects power in the region. And this was during the 1990s. And according to Clinton's own account, Arafat was offered approximately 94% of the West Bank. That's what they're fighting about now, along with Gaza. And nevertheless, he walked away from this. He said, no. Now, whether you agree with every aspect of those negotiations, that's besides the point. We're not going to quibble here about this thing or that thing. The point is that reality is almost always more complicated than the simple morality plays presented by the postmodernists. Likewise, I think it is absolutely essential to distinguish between governments and peoples. I have criticized Benjamin Netanyahu repeatedly on this program. That does not require me to condemn the Israeli people. Those are entirely different propositions. Likewise, I distinguish between the government of the Islamic Republic and the Iranian people, who are essentially held hostage by their own government. These were people who were very pro-American in the past. They were very westernized. So those are not the same thing either. The Iranian people are heirs to one of the oldest civilizations, not as old as Western, by the way. Western civilization beats it by about 300 years. I approximate about 2,800 years. The Iranian civilization, the Medes and the Persians, about 2,500 years. But it's one of the oldest civilizations on the earth, nevertheless, and time again, they have demonstrated aspirations that cannot simply be equated with the policies of the government that rules them. Like I said, they are held hostage by their government. Governments are not people. Regimes are not civilizations. One of the great failures, in my opinion, of postmodern thinking uh, is that it blurs those distinctions. It teaches people to think in slogans rather than in realities. It teaches them to condemn entire civilizations while excusing oppressive regimes, simply because those regimes happen to oppose the West. That that is precisely. It's backwards. It's ass backwards, because I hear commentators speak as though the enemies of Western civilization are somehow carrying humanity forward. You know, I don't believe that. In many cases, I think precisely the opposite is true. Many of these movements are profoundly reactionary. They're not progressive. They are retrograde. They are backwards. They move civilization backward, not forward. And yet, they're often spoken of as though they represent the future. And I'm sorry. Here at Politics by Jake, we reject that. I reject that completely. I believe one of the great intellectual mistakes of our time is confusing opposition to Western civilization with progress. Uh, they're not remotely the same thing. One of the reasons I spend so much time on this program talking about systems instead of merely events is because I want to give a name to the forces operating beneath the headline. People hear these arguments every day, and I'm telling you, they're part of a tissue of lies. What they are almost never is, they're almost never told that these arguments arise from a coherent intellectual tradition. Postmodernism. That's why I'm talking to you about it. It has a name, it has a face. That tradition has a name. It is postmodernism. Now, I readily acknowledge that not everyone expressing these views thinks of himself or himself as a postmodernist. Most have probably never, heard the word used outside a college classroom. That is precisely my point. An operating system does not require its users to understand how it was written. It simply runs in the background. Postmodernism has become like that. Not merely a philosophy, an atmosphere, a coffee clash atmosphere, if you will, a lens, a way of organizing reality before the facts are ever examined. And once you recognize that operating system, the applications suddenly begin to make sense. The recurring narratives, the recurring assumptions, the recurring conclusions. They're no longer isolated opinions. They're expressions of a common intellectual framework. That's why I wanted to put a name on it, because once something has a name, you begin to recognize it wherever it appears. And I believe that one of the principal purposes of Politics by Jake, not merely to describe events, but to identify the systems. Brian says that on the show every week. Listen to the intro. The systems that produce them, not merely to report the headlines, but to reveal the architecture beneath the headlines, not merely to tell you what happened, but to explain why the same kinds of things keep happening again and again and again. And once you understand the operating system, the applications suddenly make sense. And that is Politics by Jake.